Ruben Schwartz here from Sales for Nerds, kicking off the Sales for Nerds podcast. If you feel more comfortable with SQL than sales calls, more at home writing test suites than proposals, more interested in crunching numbers than shaking hands, if you think networking should be about routers rather than cocktails with strangers, if you're more interested in debating code editors than negotiating deals, but somehow you ended up responsible for some of those sales and marketing activities, this is the podcast for you. All right, today I'm super excited to have Brennan Dunn on Sales for Nerds. Brennan is a multi-talented guy, and I'm just going to go through this bio, and it's going to take a minute, but bear with me. He started off by studying electrical engineering, and then decided he didn't like electrical engineering, and he wanted to study ancient languages, ancient Greek and Latin, and then he became a freelance developer. He built and scaled and sold an agency. Then he started a software company. Some of you guys may have heard of PlanScope that helps consultants manage their projects. And then while doing that, he started Double Your Freelancing, which is a training resource to help freelancers and agencies earn more money. And we'll get into this in more detail later, but it's one of my regrets that I never thought of that first. And recently, he co-founded RightMessage, a software company that helps bring on-site personalization to everybody. So Brennan, thanks a lot. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Ruben, for having me.
All right. I've been a longtime reader on your mailing list, so thanks for taking the time. And I know that you are holding off until you go out later this evening. And despite my upcoming soccer match, I've got a glass of, I think I pronounce this Leda Pinot Noir from Chile, which has a nice little Chilean bite to it. But as we get into things, I like to start by asking people how they got started. And you have such an interesting journey, right? Electrical engineering to classical languages, back to software and all this stuff. What was going through your mind? What was your plan at that point?
So we could even go further back in time. So I've always been into computers. I had an Apple IIe as a kid. I did dumb things like I'd write school reports on it, but there was no way to print or save. So I'd need to hand code or handwrite it into my actual written, because back then, before I guess everyone had printers, you would actually write school reports, right? Double space and all that good stuff.
Yes.
But I was really into computers, and this was pre-internet, and I just remember I'd pick up like a book. I found a book at the library on tricks of the game programming guru. So like a lot of developers, I started thinking I would code games because I was into video games and it made sense. But I was also, 8? That kind of got me into the idea of just computers and coding and all the good stuff. In high school, I was introduced to Linux, and I thought I'd be really edgy by getting off of what everyone was running, like Windows 98 or whatever at the time. Thought it would be cool to run Linux and change my keyboard to Dvorak or Dvorak or however you pronounce it,
right,
while leaving the keycaps actually as QWERTY. So, I one of those type, teenagers, right, who just wanted to, but in doing that, I learned this operating system, and that taught me the command line, and I got into actual programming at the time. So I got into, I started to teach myself basics of building websites with like PHP, no framework or anything, just raw PHP to render a page. And then I got to the point where it was time to graduate high school. And I thought it would make sense at the time. I had a full scholarship to go to Florida State. And I figured I'd go there and I'd do something kind of marketable, like engineering sounded fun. I thought it would be cool to do whatever electrical engineers did. And I did that for about a year.
And you didn't know at that point, it just sounded cool.
It just sounded fun, yeah. I watched a lot of if you ever remember Modern Marvels on the History Channel, they'd always have showcasing cool bridges that are built and cool technology. And I thought maybe that's what I do. So, I was doing that, and it wasn't for me, I realized pretty quickly. And I was also really itching to do something. I didn't want to mix what I was passionate in a hobby. I thought of computers as like a hobby for me, and I didn't want it to be a career. So I thought I'd do the complete opposite of what I took a class while at Florida State that went through the whole Iliad, Homer's Iliad. And I really liked it. And I thought, I want to do something different. Maybe I want to do something different. Maybe it was existential crisis at age 19. So I decided to go to a college in Maryland called St. John's College, where 400 students. There's no majors. Everyone's on the same curriculum. You start with ancient Greek, work your way through the Romans, then medieval, and then modern day, and Renaissance and Enlightenment and everything. And I really liked it. But the one thing that I don't think made it to the bio you said is that I actually dropped out to start a software company. And the software company was a company called Agathon, which again, Greek, meaning a good thing, which is something I learned at school. And what we did is we did personalized lead generation. And again, I wasn't thinking of labels or anything at the time, but I realized one freelance gig that I got on Craigslist back then was from a real estate agent who wanted to do this revenue share where if somebody would put up a website for him, any lead that he got from that website, he would split the commission. Actually, he wasn't a real estate agent, a mortgage broker. He would split that commission 50-50. I was living in my dorm room, figured what else could I do? So I did that. And it was really cool because he would, we got some leads and he'd close some of them. And by closing them, he'd get like a $4,000 or $5,000 commission and I'd get half, which when in college, $2,500 was a lot of money. And I was like, okay, this is cool. And can I scale this? So I dropped out of school to start that with a friend of mine, Anthony. And we did that. And we built up this, little business where what we would do is we would run these nationwide ads. And then depending on where like the state that traffic would come from, we would pull from our database. And we hired an outbound salesperson to do a lot of this. We would pull a local real estate agent or mortgage broker, depending on what ad they're clicking on, and basically personalize the page. So put their photo, put their logo, put their name and all this stuff. But we're running nationwide campaigns. And then if the lead got generated, it would go directly to, in this case, like the mortgage broker. And that was very different from the usual kind of like lending tree shared leads thing where, the lead you call has already been called by 50 of your competitors.
Right.
So it was quite different and it was really interesting and it worked really well. But then the subprime thing happened in 2006 or 2007 or whatever that was. The mortgage bubble burst and it all just went to crap virtually overnight because, it just fell apart. So that's when I started working at an agency I was still in Florida at the time, working at an agency down there, moved up to Virginia and started freelancing because I didn't have any business contacts here. I started freelancing for a friend of mine who was working at a company in San Francisco, a startup, doing coding for them. That did well, decided to scale an agency. That was interesting. Got the agency to 11 employees. And that's kind of like part one of the story, I guess.
Okay. And I just want to jump back to something that people may not be familiar with, the Dvorak keyboard layout. For those of you who have not heard of this, QWERTY is designed to slow down your typing, and we all use it because of the way mechanical typewriters used to jam. So if you're really hardcore and you want to be more productive, you learn Dvorak, which is something that I should really have learned to do years ago, and I never have, and at this point I never will. But it's kind of really the mark of someone who's hardcore when you learn a whole different keyboard layout.
But then you realize every key combination that every app has is kind of tied to QWERTY as a layout, and then nothing makes sense.
So when you started doing this website stuff, right, you make it sound so easy. Like, well, I'm just doing some EE and I'm learning the classics. And oh, by the way, in my side project, in my spare time, I'm getting leads for mortgage brokers, as if that's the easiest thing in the world. Tell me a little bit about how you did the sales and marketing, not for the mortgage brokers, but to pitch the mortgage brokers themselves.
So again, I had no experience ever running a company, but I did know my dad had a company growing up that basically, if you bought a timeshare and you ended up having buyer's regret, wanted to get rid of it, my dad's company would be the one you call. So to do that, he did a lot of direct marketing and he exposed me to a lot of the kind of that 80s era, putting the postcard in the mail sort of thing. And so I learned a bit about that there. And I started looking at, Google AdWords, and I realized people were typing into Google AdWords stuff like mortgage leads or real estate leads. This was the thing I did while from my dorm room was really just a single page site with a form on it that was just for this one person I worked with. And I had to trust him that, lead gets generated, he'd tell me, and then I would get a cut. So what I realized was, I'm doing this for this one person, but it's really like, it's the same stuff. Like they also sell the same thing. The form fields are even the same. Just change like the person on the site, like the picture of the person and the name and stuff like that. And I could just use that same template and get a lot of these people. And since a mortgage, for instance, they work in a specific, they have their license in a particular state. I could say, if I ran a nationwide campaign, which was a lot cheaper at the time, at least, economically than doing like more local stuff, I could run a nationwide campaign, and I'd go to these kind of like CPA marketers who would do like email marketing and such. I would pay them a certain amount per action, so cost per action. So an action would be a lead generated. So they'd run these not global, but nationwide campaigns. They'd send traffic to this single page site we set up. And then on the fly, we would just geolocate where the traffic was coming from and just say, do we have anyone in Virginia? Yes. Okay. Pull somebody who we owe, who basically has credits. So you would buy, if you were a mortgage broker, you would buy like a pack of 100 credits from us of leads. And then we would just keep, there'd be a chance you could get a credit from us if somebody visited the site and it rendered with your branding on it, and then they opted in, we would deduct one from your credits and send you the lead in real time. And this was like super advanced for these people. So
yeah, now, and I guess I'm trying to figure out, how did you get the mortgage brokers to say, okay, I'm going to buy 100 credits, or they didn't have any risk because they only paid if they closed the lead?
They paid per lead. We didn't jump into making sure they actually closed them or anything like that. But they were jumping all over it because these were exclusive real-time leads, where most things that they were dealing with were shared leads from generated a few days back. So the whole banks compete, you win ad from that whole thing. All they're doing is saying, you fill in a form on our site and we sell your information to 100 people. And that's what they mean by banks compete, you win. But at the end of the day, they all sell the same product. So they also mortgages, right? So we were just saying, why be the 40th person to call this lead, and you're not going to get anywhere with them, and they're not going to know who you are. Instead, pay us more, and we'll give you a lead immediately while they're still looking at your website, or not your website, but like a website with your face on it, and you're the only one who's going to be calling them. And that was really attractive to people.
That's a great pitch. And so you did your own marketing to sign up the mortgage brokers. And then would they call you and say, hey, I got your postcard or whatever, we're interested?
No. So we didn't do any direct mail. What we did is we just ran Adwords and targeted. Okay. So we basically just had a lead form for ourselves. And I found a guy on, I think, Craigslist, actually, who was just kind of like Bostonian sales guy type role, like very alpha, very energetic, very, that kind of person, right? And I'm just here, I'm coding this thing, and Anthony's doing the business management side. Again, we didn't really know what we were doing, but this guy Pete came in, and we would just generate leads. We generated quite a few a day. I mean, we were spending probably $20, $25 to get a lead, and then he'd be in the office with us. Lead would come in, he'd get on the phone, call them, explain pitch it to them, just kind of like what I did, and then they'd buy a pack of 100. And, we used to say, if the leads aren't good or whatever else, you just ask and you'll get a refund on whatever the difference is. And yeah, that was our model, and it worked really well.
So strongly differentiated offering, super valuable, easy value prop. And then I guess the other key thing is you outsource the actual sales to this guy, Pete, who's like already a sales rep.
Right. And it was all inbound. He just sat back, the leads came to him. They were all qualified. There was no cold calling or anything for him. So he liked that.
Right.
So yeah. And then we just paid him commission.
Got it. Okay. Makes a lot of sense. Okay. And so then the economy and the mortgage market cratered. And so you had to do something else.
Yeah. So here I was, this former, I guess, owner of this company who had to get a job. I was doing PHP at the time. I built the whole thing in PHP. And I just went on like Monster, one of the sites, and found a company that was hiring PHP developers. Went there, and they were a interactive agency, so they were just a big consulting company. And it was interesting because that was my really first experience getting to see how like consulting firms worked. Mm-hmm. I'd done, I guess, some freelancing things in college, but not to that level. So got to work there and kind of worked my way up. Was running the technology division it was like a team of 30, so not too huge, but it was nice because I got to travel a lot. They had clients who were like major resorts and airlines. I got to just sit in on like boardroom meetings, which to me was really helpful to see.
Sure.
Because I'd be the tech guy there who's there to answer any technical questions they might have, but I got to see how they sold and see how all that worked, right? So it was hugely valuable. But then when I moved out of state, I had to kind of start from scratch.
Yeah, and that's how I wouldn't say it's how I got into sales. It's how I got exposed to real sales right? By being the tech guy in the room and just listening to how the real
Right.
conversations went. So you're at this firm. How long do you stay there? How does it go? And when do you decide, hey, I need to strike out on my own again?
I mean, I was probably only there a little over a year. I think I started around Christmas and ended the next New Year's next year. Not too long. And then when I wanted to escape Florida and went up to Virginia, I didn't know the business community here, but I was learning this new technology called Ruby on Rails at the time. And I was really interested in that compared to what I was doing with PHP. It was just total new world for me. So I had a friend from college who was living out in the Bay Area, and he knew somebody who needed help with their start. They were just looking for Ruby developers, and there weren't many of them because their stack was Ruby. And so I basically worked from home as a freelancer. It's a very contract based, like what do Ruby developers make, and I charged that. And then I was basically staff augmentation for them. It wasn't a consultant relationship at all. It was just they needed help. I came in and did it. But then I started to get as is a lot of startups, somebody would leave and then they'd go work at a different company and they'd be like, oh, this Brennan guy's pretty good. They'd come out, reach out to me, and then I'd get, multiple people who wanted to work with me. And I realized I could either turn away the work or I could maybe grow a company beyond myself. And I decided on the latter. And I just, at the time I was starting to go to like Ruby conferences, regional ones. I got to meet a few other people who were kind of like me. I mean, they were coders. Many of them were freelancing. And basically what I started to do with them was like, how about this? I will bill you out at one rate and pay you a different rate, but you won't need to deal with any selling or invoicing or any of that stuff. Just code. Like you get to be a freelancer, but you don't need to worry about the admin side. So that's how I started the agency. And then I got to this point where I realized I wanted to make it more of a proper agency with employees in an office. I don't know what I was smoking, but I decided I wanted something like that. And then the company kind of shifted from being this remote team of contractors to a proper brick and mortar agency. And that's when things got really fun, because that's when I started to really understand what it meant to be a consultant, what we were really selling, and all that kind of stuff. It was really interesting because as we started to grow, I was less involved day to day in the actual projects and more managing a team. And I had to learn kind of things, a lot of things on the fly that I never thought I'd ever need to deal with. Yeah, I mean, we grew to 11 employees and, it did well, but I realized we were building software and products for other people. And I had friends who were running software businesses. And I like the idea of having a lot of people paying a little bit versus a few small people paying you a lot.
Yep.
It just seemed a lot better. I bootstrapped PlanScope while running that company, which is really nice because the company paid the bills while I built this. And then I realized it was really hard to run a SaaS and an agency simultaneously. So I left the SaaS. I had started to focus on that.
So you mentioned earlier, you kind of had to learn what you were really selling. What did you think you were selling, and what were you really selling at this agency?
Well, I thought I was selling code. Like most technical types, I thought, people were paying me because they needed code written. And what was interesting was as we started to move away from like staff augmentation, which is how I started, to more people coming to us saying, really, we've got this problem that we need to get solved. We think maybe building a web app will help us solve it. It was then that I really started to, and I surrounded myself with a few really smart people who had realized that we're not reinventing the wheel here. Businesses have always paid for solutions, and really what we're selling is a solution that happens to be fulfilled by code in our case. So if I could focus more on the solution and sell the solution to a specific business problem or set of problems, that would be better because it ends up allowing us to make sure we write the right code, which is something I think a lot of us don't think about too much. When I started the agency, I'd go to like a networking event and people would ask what I did. And this wasn't at like a conference. I'd say like I run a Ruby shop. And I mean, these people probably thought I was like, selling jewels out of my garage or something, right? So, but, I realized that as I started to move away from the technology and more focus on why were people willing to pay lots and lots of money for code, and started to internalize why they were doing that and what that meant for us as a business, that's when things started to really shift for us.
And I don't know about you, but I remember when Ruby came on the scene and Ruby on Rails, I felt like it was a pretty significant jump in productivity. And if you were just billing by the hour, you were basically shifting massive amounts of value and money from yourself to your customers.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. I mean, I didn't even think about it at the time, but yes. I mean, it was having gone from like writing SQL queries in PHP, because I wasn't using an ORM or object relational mapper or whatever they're called. I was writing raw SQL and working with that. Instead in Rails, being able to say like, user.find or user.where name equals Bob, being able to do that was just night and day. And yeah, it made things a lot faster.
I mean, I even remember the Java and the Java ORMs and all that, and thinking, gosh, this is so much better than raw C and C++. But then when Ruby and Rails came along, you could just get so much done in relatively little time. And I remember trying to make sure that we were capturing value appropriately based on what outcome we were delivering versus how many hours people thought this was supposed to take, because people would be blown away by how quickly you could deliver value, especially these big companies that were used to doing, they thought Java was cutting edge.
Right, exactly. And that's the thing is, again, we were just thinking, I know what I pay my team. And it was a lot easier, I think, when I had contractors, because I basically said, I'm going to bill us out at this and I'm going to pay you this.
Right.
So there's a very clear bottom line. Whereas when we shifted to more full service, I guess, where we ended up having 2 designers on staff, and we were doing the design and the development. And then we got into strategy, and, it became less of us just being hired guns and more of a proper consulting business. That's when we shifted more towards value-based pricing and away from charging for the time. And at the end, our clients didn't even know like how much time or who went into the projects. They just got the results.
Right.
So yeah, it was a big eye opener for me.
And so you started PlanScope. Maybe talk to me a little bit about, I think every technical consultant has this dilemma where on one hand, consulting is kind of fun and cool, especially once you kind of figure out what people are actually buying, as you mentioned. And then at the same time, we all want to build products. It's just kind of in our nature, I think. How did that work itself out?
So I had taken Amy Hoy's 30 by 500 course. Because I mean, like a lot of us, I had seen a lot of my clients fail, not because of anything we did, but because the ideas were just dead on arrival. So I'd taken her course, which she, had I liked her thinking on things where it was very, B2B, let's build things safely that are actual problems that people want solved and are willing to pay for it, versus like, Airbnb for X. So, I went through that, and that really inspired me and helped me better understand how to build a really good online software business that would be more likely to succeed, which is what I cared about. So, there was a bit of that, and there was also a bit of like scratching my own itch. I wish I had a tool like this while running my agency.
Right.
So that led to developing PlanScope, which, like you said, is a project management tool for freelancers and agencies. The difference, though, was we wanted you to be able to see as a client how your progress stacked up against budget burn. Mm-hmm. So you'd be able to see in real time. Usually there's a disconnect between the project management tool and invoicing. Mm-hmm. So we wanted there to be more harmony, I guess, between the two. So that was the tool, and it did well, and it was very benefit focused, and it was hard. I mean, project management's a tough space to be in, but we did fairly well considering what we were up against. But what I realized is, unlike with high touch sales, where I'm doing a lot of networking and in-person stuff, this meant getting people. I mean, growing a business at $24 a month, you can't be doing a lot of high touch stuff.
Right.
So I had to get good at how do I generate low touch leads? How do I generate leads that they can go to my site, plug in a credit card, and go from there? And that's where I got into the whole, I can write content, not on project management, but about things related to the businesses that the people I'm attracting want, like pricing or how to sell your consulting, or how do I write proposals or anything like that, that wasn't really within the scope of a project management tool, but it related to the needs that people going to Google and typing in, how do I make more as a freelancer? They find my site, and then they hopefully join PlanScope. That was the goal. And that's where what eventually became Delivery Freelancing came from.
So it's kind of like each thing led to its own spin-off.
Yeah. So I needed leads for PlanScope, and I thought I will create content targeting freelancers, and hopefully people will like that content and maybe sign up for my SaaS. That was the plan. Didn't really work as well as I thought it would. So, but then I started realizing that people would pay for products that were training products for helping them on a deeper level raise their prices or get more clients or something like that. And before I knew it, Double Your Freelancing was now its own beast with a product lineup. And I mean, there was PlanScope, I guess, humming along in the background, but PlanScope was doing maybe, it never even surpassed 5 figures monthly, but here was Double Your Freelancing doing 7 figures a year. So it was, I realized I couldn't manage both any longer. So I sold PlanScope early 2016.
And I remember when Double Your Freelancing was announced, I got a couple emails from other people because, I'm sort of in this related area where I would help people with their pricing and their proposals and so on. And at the time I was working with mostly big companies, but I worked with small companies as well. And I just never thought to productize it the way you did. And these emails would be like, hey, this is the thing you should have done. And I looked at it and I was like, yeah, that's totally the thing I should have done. Why didn't I do that? How did you go from, hey, I've got this content that's helpful to people in my audience to, I'm going to package this up and sell it?
So another kind of accidental thing, I wanted to go to a conference in Ireland, and there were budget constraints. I didn't have the money to go, and PlanScope was it wasn't doing great, but it was making some money. Again, Amy Hoy, enter Amy Hoy again. She was going to the conference, her and her husband were going, and they invited me to go. And they're like, well, just, you've been writing a lot about pricing and stuff, and I know you've been doing some, because in PlanScope, you could enter in your rate. And then I'd get, through the support channel of PlanScope, people would ask questions about pricing, which didn't really seem in scope, but I entered regardless.
What should I put in that box there?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. So I jump on Skype calls, I talk to them, and I just relay a lot of what I learned with the agency. And then she was like, well, why not just do an ebook on pricing? I was like, I'm not going to write an ebook, but I did it finally after a lot of convincing. It worked well and people pre-ordered it and I could go to the conference, and then I had to write a book. So I rushed to write the book. And that's where my weekly newsletter came from, because I was thinking that if I already had their money, I had to give them something. I couldn't just say, yeah, a book will come eventually.
Right.
So, and it was only $29. So it wasn't like a huge amount, but it was still, I felt worthwhile enough. So I would write to them weekly about what I'm working on with the book. And then once I shipped the book, I was thinking, okay, well, maybe I'll stop writing weekly, but I enjoyed it. So I kept it going. And then I would get people. I remember somebody on the list who had bought the book, because the only way to get on the list was to buy the book, said, hey, a friend of mine wants to get these emails. Is there any way for them to sign up? I was like, no. So that's when I, started doing this. And it led to really just, I released the ebook, which is 4 or 5 years ago or something like that. And people would write in saying, this is cool, but I need some help getting clients, or I want to scale an agency like you did. And that led to every product I did basically emerged from just talking with people. I mean, one thing I think is something that I now recommend a lot of people do is I never had any sales pages until I'd sold quite a few copies of whatever it is I was launching over email or over Skype, because that helped me determine what objections they had, what resonating well, what wasn't, and so on. And that allowed me to get the data I needed to write really good sales copy.
Now, when you say quite a few, what does that mean? And how does it vary, I guess, depending on what you're selling?
So I was doing this online workshop that was a 2-day thing through a Google Hangout of up to 14 other people. And it started with me just doing my normal weekly newsletter after launching Double Your Freelancing Rate, like a few months or 6 months or so later. And I just put a PS saying, hey, I'm thinking of doing a workshop for people who want to grow an agency and scale beyond themselves. If you're interested, reply back and I'll tell you more. And I got a few dozen people who were interested and started conversing with them. And they helped me flesh out exactly what the product would look like and what it would include. And I did that for a while. And then I just asked them, like, hey, if for $1,000, will you do it? And I got enough people to do the first class. So now I had 14 people or 14,000 that without any entirely sold over email. And then I did that, I think, 2 more times before I actually then put together a proper site that at that point now had testimonials, because I had, however many people go through it, 30 something. And yeah, I mean, it was just, I kind of kept with that really with everything I've done, because I realized it's better to really just dig in and talk to people and ask them about like, what goal you want to get to next, and then seeing how I could come in and help them get from here to there. And, whether I'm selling consulting or whether I'm selling a turnkey product, really the same rules apply. And once I really hone in on what is a common problem described in a certain way that these companies have, that's when I'm then able to go in and write copy and put together a sales page.
And so this whole time, I don't know if I'm summarizing this right, but as I'm hearing this, I'm hearing that you do a bunch of research that might be described as marketing, right? You have an audience, you build an audience, and you kind of casually invite people to discuss what the next step might be with you, but you're not actually selling them yet. Is that fair?
That's correct. Yep.
And so it's a very easy conversation. I think there's a big difference between an exploratory conversation and a sales conversation. And especially for people from a technical background, I think we're often very good at the exploratory conversations and not so good at the sales conversations. And something I often ask people to do is, well, just stop trying to sell something and just ask people what's going on and don't worry about what's going to come next. And it seems like your whole process is built around that, where you never have to have a real sales conversation because you have the exploratory conversation. You can build something that's exactly what people want, at least enough people to get going. And then, like you say, you know the messaging well enough to do it all in a very low touch online manner.
Yeah. I mean, I would go into these exploratory discussions and basically tell them, like, I'm working on trying to define what I can do next. And I want to help somebody like you. And I'd ask questions and get them to talk and so on. And then I would tell them, cool, okay, well, I'll cycle back if I end up going down this path or whatever. But people at that point were in a way vested into the success of the product because they helped influence the direction of it. Mm-hmm. So when I would go back and say, oh, that thing we were talking about a few weeks ago, well, I've got something a little more proper now. And it would just be like an email template that was slightly personalized to them. But for the most part, it would be something I'd be circling back with everyone I had these discussions with and say, here's what I'm doing. And I wouldn't even have there wouldn't be a purchase link. It would literally be if you're interested in joining, just reply and I'll send you the link. That's how things started. And then eventually when it got to the point where it made sense to make that more evergreen or more turnkey, that's when I would go and put together the proper sales and fulfillment channel and stuff. And then all the channels that lead people to it and so on.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess one of the things that I'm intrigued about, one of the reasons I started this whole podcast, in fact, was to learn how other people dealt with this transition from a technical role to a role where you have responsibilities for sales and marketing. And it seems like, tell me if I'm being unfair here, but it seems like the way you have dealt with sales is by avoiding it entirely, either outsourcing it to a sort of quote unquote proper sales rep, or constructing your business in such a way that you can sort of do these low pressure exploratory meetings until you have a good enough grip on the problem and enough testimonials that you can basically do the rest with marketing and online sales.
Exactly it. The best, and this kind of dovetails into what I'm doing nowadays, the best sales copy, for instance, speaks directly to the person and their needs. And that's why I think a lot of technical types want to just describe features and, here's technically what this product is made up of. But really, when you really think about what a buyer wants, especially in a B2B context, is to go from like here to there.
Right.
And they're looking to go from my inability to correctly price myself is impacting my standard of living, or usually it's something like cash flow, right? So there's cash flow issues which are stressing them out, which leads them to think the fix is charging more. So how the medium, I guess, the structure of the product is immaterial. All that matters is getting them to fixing the root problem, which then will make their life a lot better. And then the only way to really figure that out is talking to people and learning about, like, tell me about, I think a really good framework for this is Jobs to Be Done. As a really good just concept of like, how do you actually figure out why people switch from one thing to another or switch off your thing to something else? And, getting raw language that you can then include in your marketing copy.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And the other thing that's interesting, I think, for people who just sign up to your mailing list or they listen to this podcast, they sign up to this mailing list, it's like so much wisdom in there, but it's all hard won, right? You didn't arrive on this earth knowing all this stuff.
No. I mean, it's like with everything. I mean, even you could even say, what I'm doing now with Bright Message is a extension of the lead gen stuff I was doing however many years, what was it, 15 years ago, 13 years ago, however long that was.
Yeah, it's like it came full circle.
Right, exactly. And I think that's how, I mean, I don't pretend to go into anything with like, very thought out business plans or whatnot. I just go in and I try to do my best to respond, given the experience and know-how that I have, to respond to problems people have in a way that helps them and helps me. So it's pretty straightforward and cut and dry.
Well, I think one of the nice things also about being a technical person is that sometimes you can actually change what the solution is. And so, a lot of what I build it's similar to your story, right? It's like I wanted to build stuff for myself and I was irritated that I had to struggle with certain things. So I built ways to make it easier. And you looked at typical project planning and how it didn't line up with invoicing, and you were able to create a solution for that. Or you look at how website marketing works. When you were doing the mortgage broker stuff, you could hard code it yourself to reflect the right message for individual people. And now with the right message, you're saying, well, let's let anyone have access to that kind of technology.
I mean, that's exactly it, right? Is, with the right message, which is kind of the next step, which is something I've been doing really since 2013. I've been personalizing double your freelancing stuff. I actually started with PlanScope, but I've been doing it mostly with double your freelancing, where I've got designers, programmers, writers, marketers, and so on who use my stuff. I realized, I'd be getting emails from designers reading a product of mine and emailing me saying, hey, here's a bit about me. I'm a designer. It seems like your background is you're a developer, and a lot of the language you use is obviously very developerish. Can this actually help me? And I realized that for every email I got similar to that, there's probably 1,000 people who thought that and closed the tab,
right,
and didn't buy. Because, it would frustrate me because I'd just say, look, the course is about how to properly sell B2B high-touch sales stuff, right? Like, how do you, like, when you get a new lead, what do you do with them, regardless of the medium, regardless of the kind of work you do? But it's really hard to communicate that without sounding like totally generic. So I just started doing things like, oh, if this person came from a web design blog, assuming they're a designer, then if they go to the product page, speak to them as a designer. And I did that in like ridiculous, uptick in conversions. And it makes sense. It's like, why do niche products work so well? They work well because they're very relevant to the person who is looking at them, right? So it's basically the ability to niche on the fly, which is what I've been doing for my own stuff for a while. And then I released a course on marketing automation last year that included lessons on this. And a lot of people in that course were like, I want this. And I'm like, okay, cool. Here's the code I use on my site. And they're like, I don't know what that means. And that's what led to breaking ground on the actual software.
So it's kind of like, if you help enough people, they're always going to have a next step that they want. They're like, thanks so much for this. Here's what I need to do now. Can you help me with that? Because you did a great job on the last thing.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, this came from me learning marketing automation because I had to for my business and just being very open about my learning of it. And that got people saying, I want to know that too. So I did a course. And then that got people saying, I want this personalization stuff too. I'm like, well, here's a V0.1. And they're like, this isn't cutting it. And that, I mean, everything is kind of cause and effect. Nothing was ever like, I'm going to develop this new SaaS. And I see that a lot, unfortunately. Like, I see companies or businesses that you can tell it was just them thinking back, like, what is an idea I could tap into or something like that? And they start from there, and they can't really connect. And I think the way they need to with the core need that people have with, say, that product. And they end up not doing as well as a result. So I think just by having this like responsive, everything, business for me has been a giant multi-chained responsive exercise where I'm just doing one thing, listening to results, iterating on that, trying something new, iterating on that, and so on. And it's worked well.
It's like a giant while loop, right? while
Exactly. Pretty much.
And now a quick shout out to Tech Startup Guy, who left a 5-star review on iTunes. Core of the rotation. After listening to the first 3 episodes, I can say that this is definitely going to be a core part of my podcast rotation. It's heavy on the education and light on the BS that makes most business podcasts so boring. As a techie myself, I find the guests relatable and inspiring. Top marks. Thanks so much, Tech Startup Guy. We'll keep them coming, and if you'd like to leave a review, we'd love to hear from you. And if you've got a question, a topic you'd want us to go into, or a guest, or if you want to be a guest, leave a note at salesfornerds.io. Thanks a lot. So did the classical Greek and Latin, did that ever come back into play? Is there a full circle there?
Yeah, so actually, I'm not a big fan of Plato, or Socrates as the guy who's featured in Plato's dialogues. But they're the Socratic Method, which is so you read Plato, it's all dialogue.
Right.
And it's all, you start with somebody who has this assumption or thought or belief. And Socrates doesn't say you're wrong, here's what you need to do instead. His form of questioning is really just a way to kind of peel back the layers and to get the person he's talking with to realize that they have a flawed belief about something or something else. So his usage of it was getting people to, in his mind, embrace quote unquote correct philosophy. But the way of doing the questioning is very useful. I mean, lawyers use it, psychologists use it, but I started using it as a consultant to really figure out, okay, if they're coming to me with a website redesign, they really don't want a website redesign. They want something else. If I can figure out what that really is, maybe it's more customers, maybe they want to scale and open up a new location or something like that. If I could figure out what that is, I can actually give them the right website. So that was hugely instrumental in helping me be a good teacher, I think, of people who are technical freelancers who want to, have some outcome like making more money, which sounds very sexy on paper. But my whole thing is, well, if you want to do that, you need to deliver a better product. And to deliver a better product means, in the case of consulting, to deliver a lower risk product that has a higher likelihood of success in the truest sense of the form, not just here's a functioning website, but is this website actually achieving what the client needs it to? And the only way to do that is to make sure that you understand what's at stake and what needs to be solved, instead of just going in like I used to and saying, okay, what do you need built? So that all came straight out of Athens circa 500 BC. That kind of stuff, even though you might, people say liberal arts is useless and doesn't have direct application or whatever else. I think the ability to learn how to psychoanalyze and really think through like problems and look at like that kind of stuff has been actually really helpful for helping me get to what I'm doing now.
So Socrates, the original sales trainer.
Maybe, yeah. I'm sure there's some like cheap business book that's like that, like basically rip that off. But yes, something like that, right? Where, yeah, I mean, it's basically, it's just more about like the best salesperson listens. The best salesperson knows how to listen and respond in kind with how their product can align correctly with the need that this person has. And I think that's a skill that can be acquired. And it's something I think that a lot of us, not to rip on traditional education, but those of us who just learned how to memorize and fill out a multiple choice test, it's harder to do that. Having hired a lot of people, I've realized just how not many people seem to be that good at critical thought. So.
One, it's not something that we get a ton of training in the educational system, and sort of having critical thought in one head is hard enough, but having critical thought in multiple heads, if you are having a sales conversation with someone, or heaven forbid, a whole team of people who may not be on exactly the same page, having that questioning method where you're not just trying to sell them something and building up a wall of resistance, but where you can kind of let them unpack what's going on and help them decide for themselves what the right way forward is, which in many cases will be with you and in some cases may not be with you. But it's like, I think it's the sort of the low resistance way, right? If you're just helping people reveal their own thoughts. Exactly
right. Yep.
So there you go, guys. If you're still in school, drop that computer science degree and go take some ancient Greek. That's the takeaway, clearly. All right, maybe not, but I think that's a very important point, right? We tend to be very focused on the technical skills, and that's exactly why this podcast is here. That's exactly why a lot of Brennan's work is here, is because there's all these people who know how to do something, but it's harder to situate it in the human context.
I think, since this is a show for sales, I think the thing that made me comfortable with it is it's really just aligning, like, this is a need. I have a way to potentially solve a need. If I'm a good salesperson, I'm finding out, given my product, can it actually help with your need, right? And I think it's harder when you're selling services, let's say you're a consultant, because your product is really vague. You don't have a product. It's experience, right? So it's about, you need to basically come up with a one-off product every time you consult. And the product, but still needs to solve the underlying issue at hand. And it's just one of those things that it just takes, like, internalizing that and realizing that people don't pay you lots of money for, whether it's software they're buying from a software company or code they're getting from a freelance developer, or anything in between, realizing why do companies pay for things? I mean, really simple B2B stuff. Businesses pay for things to make more money or to spend less money or to lose less money. So that's why people are hiring you. So if you can figure out how can you be an investment, whether you're selling a service to businesses or a product to businesses, how can you frame what it is you're doing as an investment, which a business typically cares about a return on investment that's financial. So figure that out and figure out how what it is you're doing fits into that. And that's what you sell through the medium of your technical product.
And that kind of goes back to that Socratic questioning, right? When someone says, hey, can you implement a PHP form on the website? You can say, yes, it takes 2 hours and the cost is $200 or whatever. Or if you say, well, why do you need that form and why do you need that and what happens then and why that, you realize this is a multi-million-dollar problem, right? Maybe it goes beyond the simple form on the website, but for a small amount of extra work, you solve a much bigger problem and you bring home a much bigger paycheck.
Exactly. And I think, if somebody's coming to you directly and saying, I need a PHP form, it's not always going to be easy to do a lot of what we're advocating because, again, somebody like that might actually know exactly they need somebody to swing the hammer for them.
Right.
Right. But I've realized that much of it means finding a client. So, my whole thing is when we were doing web apps, for somebody to get to the realization that their problem at hand can be solved by going to a web app development company, if we're at that point, we've already in a way lost, right? So what we ended up doing was trying to think back of, well, how can we intercept people before they've gone through that mental funnel of, I have a problem. Can this problem be solved? Yes. How can it be solved? Maybe I'll find a developer. What does that even mean? Here's what that means. How do I find a web developer? Oh, this is how I find them. If you think of that as like a funnel that needs to be gone through in order to get to the point of hiring a web developer, if you can go further back and look for people who you can intercept them when they're still at the I have a problem stage, then the pool is bigger because a lot of people who could benefit from you don't know they could benefit from you. And the pool is bigger, but it's also you're able to meet them on a very consultative plane rather than them just saying, I need a coder. How much do you charge for code?
Right. And you're also able to influence the direction of what they're trying to do. And because in many cases where they want to go is directionally accurate, but perhaps it's not really the right solution. And a lot of times they can go spend a whole bunch of money and not solve their real problem.
Exactly. Exactly right. Yep.
Well, Brennan, thanks so much. This has been wonderful. If you folks listening do not know much about Brennan, go check out his background. We'll have a bunch of links in the show notes. I've been reading Brennan's stuff for years, and I'm still learning some wonderful new things here, including the importance of the classical education. Thanks so much, Brennan. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Ruben, for having me.